Good evening and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Forum and the Kennedy School of Government. My name is Chris Stone. I'm the faculty director of the Hauser Center for Nonprofit Organizations, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. My role is simple. I am introducing our program and then handing the program over to Marty Chen, who will be your moderator for this discussion on worker protection in a global economy. This program is one of several this spring that marks the start of the second decade of the Hauser Center for Nonprofit Organizations. And we're delighted to sponsor this event this evening with the Harvard University Committee on Human Rights Studies, the Kennedy School's Ramani Center for Business and Government, directed by John Ruggie, who is on the panel, and the European Studies Undergraduate Board. Marty Chen, our moderator, is not only my colleague at the Hauser Center and a lecturer here at the Kennedy School, but is also the director of the WeGo Network, a remarkable organization working to advance understanding and the practice of human rights for workers in the informal economy around the world. Marty.
Thank you. Good evening. It's a real pleasure to join Chris Stone in welcoming you to this evening's event on worker protection in a global economy, the role of government, business, and civil society. Let me say a few words about the topic for this evening's event before introducing our speakers. Historically, worker protection has relied on collective bargaining and protective legislation. But in today's global economy, these means of protection are decreasingly effective. Why is this so? This is because there are many new entrants into the global labor pool from China, India, and the former Soviet bloc. Richard Freeman, one of our panelists, estimates that the global labor force has doubled over the past 2 decades. With so many new entrants into the global labor pool, the bargaining power of labor has been undermined, and Richard will explain why. This is also because the global production system by which jobs are outsourced to different countries and can be moved within countries with the click of a mouse undermines collective bargaining and protective legislation. The net result is the growth in the share of unprotected workers in the global labor force. The protection gap has many dimensions: lack of minimum wages and worker benefits, lack of social protection, lack of occupational health and safety, and lack of organization and voice. There is a need, therefore, to reconsider and reshape worker protection in today's global economy. We are fortunate to have with us tonight 3 eminent experts on this topic. And as Chris has suggested, we've asked them to speak on the role of business and government and civil society in trying to promote worker protection, sometimes in very innovative, new, hybrid ways working together. Our first speaker and very honored guest tonight is Mary Robinson, the first woman president of Ireland, the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and current chair as well as founding member of the Council of Women World Leaders. No, you have to sit. I haven't introduced everyone. Mary Robinson has been a human rights advocate all of her life. As a barrister, an academic, she won't let me continue. And I was going to introduce all of them.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. Let me just say a few final words about Mary, and then I'll introduce the others later. She has been an active member of the Commission on the Legal Empowerment of the Poor, and she's now based in New York. So having been in government, having been with the UN, she now heads a remarkable global cross-sector human rights initiative, she calls it, Realizing Rights, the Ethical Globalization Initiative. So it's my honor to hand it over to the Honorable Mary Robinson. Sorry.
Actually, I think I owe Marty an apology. It's just, I've got to that bossy stage in my life where I can be able to stop long introductions, and you weren't really going to do that. But I also wanted to express my genuine pleasure to be back here in Harvard, to be in the Hauser Center. I'd like to thank Steve and Marty and all who've been involved in organizing this. It's a wonderful venue, as I know from the past, for a discussion that should happen and happen more often and happen more deeply. And maybe we're going to start something this evening that will catch on a bit in the various places that it should catch on. And I'd like to start with a simple point of why this topic is important. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, created, as you know and as you've heard, exactly 60 years ago, states in Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Dignity coming before rights. What does dignity mean? What do the visionaries of the Universal Declaration mean when they put dignity before rights? Yet so many workers in global supply chains are not able to live a life of dignity and don't enjoy their human rights. So that's our starting point. Don't live a life of dignity. Why hasn't this been more of an issue for the human rights community? Let's be honest, from my community. Why hasn't it been more of an issue? We've cared about violations of human rights in civil and political areas, very important work. We've cared about having more aid for developing countries. But have we cared enough about terms of work, about the workplace, about the dignity of what it is to be in a sweatshop? Yes, we've cared at the kind of visible end, and we've cared a lot about child labor and exploitative conditions of labor. But what about the secret, actual conditions of labor? Have we cared enough? I hear some people say, but it's important that people have jobs, any jobs. Any jobs? I think if you've seen the conditions of some jobs, you wouldn't say that. It's not any jobs. It really isn't any jobs. It's human dignity. That's what we're talking about this evening. What do we mean by worker protection? At its most basic, we're referring to what the Universal Declaration calls, and I quote again, just and favourable conditions of work and just and favourable remuneration for work. In 1948, they understood what we should mean. These are minimum standards below which workers around the world shouldn't be allowed to fall. And these basic notions were further codified, as you know, in the ILO core labour standards and in international and national labour legislation. Three important areas are health and safety regulations, the right to form and join trade unions and to engage in collective bargaining, and non-discrimination. And today we sometimes combine these three quite properly in the decent work agenda. I'm so familiar with the decent work agenda, I sometimes wonder, do people hear those words and say, oh yes, I know what you mean by the decent work agenda? If not, let's have that as part of our conversation a little bit later. Let's just reflect on how short we are falling in giving these guarantees to workers in global supply chains. States are the primary duty bearers for guaranteeing these rights. That's something we're very familiar with in the human rights community. States have the primary responsibility. So let's look at states. And let's look at states in one part of the world and in another part of the world. Let's look at states in the rich part of the world. United States, modern Ireland, Europe, Korea, parts of the world where you have companies that have workers employed in other parts of the world. Rich countries have very rarely focused on the responsibilities of their companies' operations overseas in terms of worker rights. I've actually never heard that debate. I've never heard a trade minister or a labour minister say, I'm concerned about the conditions that some of our companies based here have of workers or supply chain workers in other countries? Have you? Have you? And then let's look at developing country governments, who all too often believe that promoting workers' rights will make them a less competitive destination. Labour is what's going to attract foreign investment. So if you start talking about decent work for your workers, are you going to deter investment? So neither the rich country governments nor the poor country governments have necessarily prioritized this agenda. And yet, states have the primary responsibility for the protection of this particular human right. Indeed, as far as developing countries are concerned, the threat is often used by companies towards developing country governments. Oh, we'll stop operations here and move to country X. And China used to be used. Maybe now it's not only China, it's other countries down further than China, because China is improving some of its worker rights, where we'll have more flexibility to determine production arrangements. So there is that race to the bottom that I'll come back to. One area where protection of workers' rights has been incorporated in intergovernmental negotiations is in some bilateral and regional trade agreements between the United States and developing countries. However, again, many developing countries fear that this is just another form of protectionism, another form of protectionism by rich countries. Those of us who support workers' rights are going to have to work harder to build constructive dialogue and support between governments, trade unions, and non-governmental organizations, including human rights organizations, to move beyond the current mistrust. You may recall, I hope, that the Universal Declaration wasn't just addressed to states. It was addressed to every individual and every organ of society. And we're talking here this evening about organs of society. So the Universal Declaration calls on all organs of society, not just states, to promote human rights. And today, the most important set of non-state actors are clearly companies in the private sector. But companies, at the moment, have few incentives to protect the human rights of overseas workers in their supply chains, and no real sanctions if they don't. Why might a company care? There should be some benefit from having a trained and stable supply of labour. But then investment is often relying on low-skilled or unskilled labour, so this doesn't always seem so evident. And there should be some benefits of consumer pressure, but that comes most easily in what I would call a traceable supply chain, such as textiles. And it's much harder to use, for example, in agricultural supply chains, like the sugar that goes into soft drinks, or the palm oil that goes into prepared foods. I have the honour to be honorary president of Oxfam. Oxfam does great work on trying to trace some of these, but sometimes it's hard to trace the way in which entities get into the supply chains, and to see where we might point to the need for higher standard of performance. In my remaining moments, because I'm conscious that Harvard is probably very strict on the 8 minutes, and maybe I'm getting close to it. I haven't got a clock anywhere, but I'm very near to finishing, so it's okay. I want to talk about what I've seen that does support protection of workers' rights in supply chains, both through my experience as a non-executive president of Ireland, but a politician before that, and the United Nations and civil society. First, it's clearly very important that workers organise themselves. And as you might have heard, I'm one of the elders. To my shock and dismay, I'm eligible to be an elder. A group of leaders who've come together at the invitation of Nelson Mandela and Graça Machel. And one of my fellow elders, Sheila Bhatt, has led the Self-Employed Women's Association, SEWA, in India. And that is a most extraordinary organisation of over 1 million women who are working in so many different capacities, sharing their experience and impacting in India and impacting worldwide. And that's, I think, a good example of how to organise. There are much more modest examples. I was in Ghana recently with Heather Grady, my colleague who's sitting in the front row here. We went to a very poor district, nothing particularly special about it, but we saw an ILO pilot project organizing the poorest workers into how, by organizing themselves, they became visible. They could join a credit union. They could participate in the health system of Ghana, and they could benefit from this kind of visibility within the informal sector. Here in the United States, I've had the opportunity again, through my connection with Oxfam, of working to support the coalition of Immokalee workers. And I was very shocked when I saw the conditions they were living in. I thought that they might maybe be focusing on the government, either the state of Florida, because I was in Immokalee with them, or the federal government. But no, they were focused on Taco Bell and Yum Inc., and rather successfully. And now they're in the process of a struggle with Burger King, and I was approached this evening as part of that struggle, which is still unresolved. So that's part of the organization, and in part of the Elders campaign to highlight human rights defenders, strong people who stand out on this. We're actually featuring their efforts by way of profiling their organization and its leader, Lucas Benitez, on the new Google Earth layer, featuring the Elders campaign, Every Human Has Rights. Those of you who haven't looked at it, go into the website, www.everyhumanhasrights.org. And I hope when you go in, you'll read the Universal Declaration and sign up, because we need 1 billion people. We're ambitious as elders. We want 1/6 of humanity to make the Universal Declaration of Human Rights personal. If I think about the modern Ireland that I had the privilege to be president of for 7 years, but I wasn't involved in the executive policy of government, as indeed Sheila de Valera, whom I had the pleasure of meeting here earlier, was. She was a minister of government. I wasn't. But I saw one of the strengths of the modern Ireland being that we were lucky enough, and still are, to be a country with a moderate, influential trade union movement. We wouldn't have made the progress in the modern Ireland if we didn't have a moderate, influential trade union movement. May we always have the sense to continue to have the good tension in discussion with government that implies. And people have been looking at growth rates in Ireland in some amazement. They've come down a bit, as they have elsewhere. But we are a successful country with a moderate, informed, educated trade union movement that is able to hold government accountable. A more recent and very inspiring example is what the government of Liberia has done to protect its workers, notably on rubber plantations. These workers have earned profits for Firestone and other companies and foreign exchange for the country of Liberia for decades. But their right to decent work conditions, to quality basic health and education had been woefully denied. And when President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf became president, she was not prepared to accept this. And with her Minister of Labour, Kofi Woods, they've shown leadership in promoting the rights of workers in Liberia on rubber plantations, insisting on renegotiating contracts, new contractual arrangements being renegotiated to achieve this. So to sum up, in terms of the private sector, I think that we have to work on several fronts to help protect workers' rights. First, governments have to take a stronger role to ensure their workers' rights are respected by domestic and international companies, and that they don't bow to pressure to weaken national labour regulations to support workers. The race to the bottom is a scramble to undermine workers' rights and shouldn't be tolerated. Second, over time, we need to develop, strengthen and implement legally binding frameworks for workers' rights that cross national boundaries, and these should be rooted in existing international law and national legislation. Third, we should encourage a growing awareness among consumers that their purchasing decisions have an impact on those producing what they consume. Consumers now have access to a whole range of websites. One I'd particularly recommend is www.business-humanrights.org, which looks at the practices, good or bad, of a whole range of companies and looks at various issues, and is a go-to place if you want to understand the responsibility of corporations and the efforts that some are making in that direction. Consumers can also support fair trade initiatives. And finally, all of this will be facilitated by building connections and a common agenda between workers across the world whose work is impacted by the same global phenomena. We could learn from the organizational prowess of those at the very bottom. I have been incredibly impressed by my friends, the Slum Dwellers Association worldwide, the way they have been connecting. I know indirectly from Marty Chen herself, the alliances of street vendors, the alliances of waste pickers. It's quite extraordinary how they're organizing, quite extraordinary. I don't think it shames us. Maybe it motivates us. It kind of raises us to know that this is going on. And so these are the challenges. Could I end with words of Eleanor Roosevelt that I want to hear again in a different way than the way I usually refer to them? I often end a talk about human rights by saying, let's remember that famous passage from Eleanor Roosevelt where she said, "Where, after all, do human rights begin? In small places close to home, so small that you cannot find them on any maps of the world." And then I usually skip that middle bit because it's not gender sensitive. She says, it is the world where his workplace, his factory, his farm. I want to come back to his and her factory and farm and workplace. That is where human rights begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Our next speaker is Richard Freeman. He's a well-known Harvard economist and one of the leading and most prolific labor economists in the world. He's the Herbert Asherman Professor of Economics and faculty director of the Labor and Work-Life Project at the Harvard Law School and head of the labor studies at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Richard.
Okay, thanks. You always think that there's an economist in a group like this, that somehow or other we're the right-wing folks who are going to say, oh, wait a minute, the market won't allow this, and so on. I want to make 3 points. First, as Marty pointed out, the economic context in the world has changed because of the China, India, the ex-Soviet joining. And this puts great pressure on workers around the world, puts pressures on wages, and it puts pressure on the way workers are treated. What we've seen in the world in the most easily measurable statistics is that because particularly China and India were really so very poor, and during this period they've grown so much, that the inequality around the world has really declined. So they've moved up, reasonably rapidly towards everyone else. But almost within every single country we look at, inequality grows. So, and China is a great example for this. The Chinese, who are the poorest people after the Mao sort of economic insanity, make this incredible growth. And China has also raised their income inequality to levels that are about equal to the US. And that's fairly sizable in a world spectrum. In terms of labor standards, you might have thought all the pressures would be to reduce standards in this period. And I don't think they are, and I'll explain why I don't think the pressures have all operated in a negative direction. I think there's great opportunities there. But I want to focus on one other fact about the world economy. This is something actually which Marty, in some sense, alerted me to the importance of the informal sector. And it turns out the informal sector, not only as we go in developing country after developing countries, 50, 60, 70, 80% of the workers, depending, of course, on the definitions and how we treat the agricultural people and so on. To my surprise, it's been rising over the last 15, 20 years. In the 10 most populous countries that we can look at, I found statistics for all but Vietnam and Bangladesh. And in 7 of those, it's gone up, and that includes China, the definition problems and so on, but it's gone up because of all the 150, 160 million peasants who moved to the rural area, the biggest migration probably in the history of humanity. And in the one country where it didn't go up, it's Indonesia. In Indonesia, it went down and then began going up, and it's still so high that you wouldn't comment on this. Then I've done some work on Korea. Korea is perhaps the most successful developing country we've ever had in the world. From absolutely total disaster, end of the Korean War. Korea is now a member of the OECD. It is competitive in many things. It's been extraordinary success. Korea, by every measure that the Korean government and economists and sociologists have devised, has had a rising share of the workforce in the informal sector. I want to just stress this. I haven't looked at what we do in the U.S. with the illegal undocumented workers, but I wouldn't shock me if we did some calculations for the U.S. and we were to find we probably may have had a similar thing. And that, I think, poses a great challenge to the worker rights and protections of people, health and safety, and so on, because the informal sector is where neither the unions nor the governments have done very much. And there's some civic society groups, but very, very small. And that is really, to me, an incredible challenge as to how we give the protections to these people. Okay, now I said I'm not going to be negative on the globalization effects, because I think globalization has really turned people's attention to the labor rights around the world. And it turned it in interesting ways. The major U.S. pension funds, CalPERS and the TIA, CREF, which is the professor's fund, and so on, all have some sort of human rights, worker rights things in there looking at investments. And that's a growing movement. So you have a capital market pressure. It may not be so much out of goodness of their hearts, but you know that if the companies you own are going to be found out, let's say, to be treating workers badly. You may remember the Gap situation, where instantly, the minute it was found that some subcontractor of the Gap was using these indentured child labor under very bad conditions, the Gap was instant to break the particular contract and get out of that, because it can have terrible effects on you. So we have capital market forces that are global in that. We have consumer pressures. The consumer pressures come about because people are willing to pay a bit more if they know some goods are made under decent conditions in whichever country they're being made. If we know they're made under horrible conditions, the demand will really go down. So the main thing of firms is to keep anybody from discovering horrible conditions or rectifying that. There's much less pressure on them to make them a little bit better. You won't see an advertisement that says, Nike makes things a little bit better in their thing. That's not where they make money. We've had just as a footnote, we've had some wonderful experiments at Harvard by Michael Hiscox of the government department, just actually estimating the elasticity of demand. How much more are people willing to pay for different products? And I say these are genuine experiments where they sold towels, and one towel says made under good conditions, and the other one doesn't say that. You never say it's made under bad conditions. No store will participate in that experiment. And so we kind of know that indeed there is an underlying human feeling towards these good workplace conditions that can be tapped. And then the country that I know the best in the developing world this year enacted a new labor law designed to give greater rights to its official unions, not to free independent unions, but nonetheless designed to provide more collective bargaining unions. This is China. And you sort of look and say, why is China pushing a new labor law that is designed to because the government fears social instability, of course, They also care about the well-being of the people who are being left behind and who are being badly treated. The extent to which it's social stability versus good feeling, I don't know. That's okay. I'm out of time, so I will leave it that China is 1/6 of the world's population, and if they are beginning to move in establishing, trying to establish worker rights, this is a sign that in the current global situation, I think we can do a lot more in this area.
Thank you, Richard. Our last, hardly least speaker is John Ruggie. He's professor of international affairs here and director of the Center for Business and Government. And I think in this context, what's worth noting in his long, distinguished career, that together with Kofi Annan, he helped found the Global Compact, which is the world's largest global corporate social responsibility initiative. And he's also serving as the special representative to the current UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on human rights and transnational corporations. John.
Thank you very much, Marty. Marty asked me to address specifically the issue of so-called voluntary initiatives and what role they play in all of this. By voluntary initiatives is meant programs, policies that companies adopt on their own or join in if they're collective initiatives, to address issues related to corporate responsibility, including labor conditions, and sometimes even promoting freedom of association and collective bargaining, but not obviously universally. Now, most large companies, I think Richard has already touched on this, most large companies in the global economy today have some set of policies in place to address these issues because social and market pressures have made it impossible for them to avoid it. This is true even of some Chinese companies. We recently did a survey of a sample of Chinese companies, and those that are in the Fortune Global 500 are beginning to have policies of voluntary measures to improve their social performance as well. Now, why do these voluntary initiatives exist? What do they do? How well and how badly do they do what they do? Those are the kinds of questions that Marty asked me to address. I think the first thing to bear in mind, and it's already been stressed this evening, is that this is not an area in which there's any shortage of laws. The laws on the books in most countries actually read pretty well. The International Labor Organization is one of the oldest international institutions. It's been there since 1919, and it has adopted in excess of 7,000 conventions, of which 1,200, it says, fall into the most important category. So we, I think, know what is required. It's been spelled out for nearly a century. We know what it is that we're supposed to be doing. The problem, obviously, is enforcement. The problem is enforcement. There's lack of enforcement of existing laws, and as Marty knows better than anybody, in most cases, existing laws don't cover the informal sector to begin with. So we've got a huge challenge. Now, the reason that enforcement and coverage are inadequate is, to put it in very simple sort of Kennedy School terms, has everything to do with power, okay, between labor and capital and between organized labor and the rest. It's fairly simple. And the power equation has to be reforged if we're going to make progress in this. So that's the background. Where do voluntary initiatives come into play here? Well, as I say, they respond to market pressure, they respond to NGO campaigns, they respond to increasingly sort of stable social expectations that companies are expected to do certain things. Which are the companies that are more responsive to those kinds of pressures? Obviously, companies that are brand sensitive, that are susceptible to social forces and social regulation. Some of the best-known collective initiatives in this area include the Fair Labor Association, which includes premium brand companies in the footwear and apparel industry, like Nike, for example. Social Accountability 8000, which will certify conditions in factories in any industry that chooses to procure their services. And Marty was kind enough to mention the Global Compact, which we started at the UN some 8 years ago. So what's good about these initiatives and what complaints do people have about them? Well, those who run them say that the best thing about them is that they exist. The person who runs the Fair Labor Organization, Orrit van Heerden, a wonderful South African activist, beat his head up against the wall in the ILO for years and wasn't making any progress. And so he decided there's got to be a better way to introduce decent working conditions in the lives of at least some people. So he helped start the Fair Labor Association, which has, I think it's 15 or 16 companies. Rick, is that right? Premium brand companies in the footwear and apparel industry. Now, for the workers in the thousands of suppliers that these companies have in Asia, in Central America, in Latin America, and South America, the conditions at work clearly are better than they otherwise would be. We have learned how to do supply chain monitoring thanks to people like Rick Locke from MIT, who's here. We've also learned the limits of supply chain monitoring. And the companies in the Fair Labor Association have, in fact, started to pool resources to help factory managers get trained in human resource management, in human rights, in what it means to have a decent workplace. And ironically, in some cases, this even includes training local labor inspectors, that is, government officials. So you have this weird cycle, right, of governments not doing their job in the first place, social pressure being put on multinational corporations, the multinational corporations beginning programs in their workplaces, which includes training labor inspectors so that the labor inspectors will inspect the factories adequately. Now, it is weird, but that's life in the global village. As I say, it covers only segments of industry. It covers those segments of industry that are responsive to social forces. Walmart is not there. They're beginning to be there on some environmental issues. They're not yet there on labor issues. Now, what's bad about these things? Well, what's bad about them, it depends on who you ask, obviously. Social activists think that voluntary initiatives are a diversion. They are a diversion because they allow companies to whitewash or greenwash or blue wash, whatever your favorite expression is. When they complain about the Global Compact, it's blue wash because of UN Blue. But so it's a diversion from what we really need to do, which is to adopt more laws. But we've got 7,000 conventions. 1,200 of them are essential. How do we do, and is this really a diversion? The answer to that is not at all clear in my view. Organized labor has been ambivalent about voluntary initiatives because they fear that, in part, it displaces labor as the appropriate unit for dealing with companies, and to some extent, of course, they're right. But the decline of unionization came along well before voluntary initiatives came along, and so that's where the ambivalence comes from. Unions will participate, but they do so with some reluctance. Obviously, voluntary initiatives have no real impact on the informal sector because it's not well connected to the kinds of companies that are susceptible to social pressures. Now, every once in a while, some group or somebody will come along and say, well, what we really need is we don't have a global treaty holding companies accountable directly under international law. And that's true. The trouble with that suggestion is that the same countries that aren't enforcing existing laws would have to ratify and implement a new law, and there's no good reason why they would do the latter when they aren't doing the former. So there is a complexity there that needs to be resolved. How do we make this system work better? The magic word has already been said. It's an old labor union saying that success depends on three things: organize, organize, organize. There is no substitute to taking back politics, to insisting through the political process that market efficiency and the quest for profits need to be balanced with human decency and a commitment to human rights. It means organizing on a transnational basis, sector by sector, as some labor federations are beginning to do. None of that will happen without political support and political activism at the grassroots. That's where we need to focus our attention, not on abstract solutions that sound good on paper but don't deliver in practice and don't reforge the political balance of power that is so skewed and that leads to human suffering in the workplace and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I will now open the floor for questions from the audience, but before doing so, I'll do the usual Kennedy School mantra, which is please identify yourself. Please identify who you're addressing your question to, and please make sure you're asking a question, not making a long comment, and a good question ends with a question mark. So we have, I can't see whether we have people up at the upstairs mics, but we have a couple here, and if you're up there, just wave a lot. Any questions from the audience? Stunned silence.
Hello, my name is Lincoln Chen. I'm with a private foundation. I wanted to ask the panelists how one sees the informal economy and decent work agenda as related to global poverty. What percentages of groups are involved, and what are the relationships between those two issues?
And who would you like to have try to address that? Mary? Yes?
Well, I'm happy in a way to at least begin the response to it, because it's actually a very good question. I've served for the last best part of 2 years on the Commission on Legal Empowerment of the Poor. And I have to say I learned a lot. I learned, as we've heard, about the extent of the totally informal economy in so many countries, and that so many people are outside the reach of what we call the rule of law, the role of the courts, all of the things that are important when you're studying in law school, etc., and in business school, etc. And it's been very chastening, I have to say, and I've given it a great deal of thought afterwards. And then I'm encouraged by the resilience of people in the informal sector who are actually making change in their circumstances, as I mentioned earlier, and organizing to do it, as John so rightly said. But it's important that we readjust how we tackle poverty. We tackle poverty by empowering the poor to tackle their circumstances. And part of that is to have better rule of law and protection and access for them. And part of that is training and job opportunities. And part of that is tackling the negatives that we've been talking a little bit about. But we won't make progress in tackling poverty until we change from us doing it in a, sorry, I've hit my button. Sorry, I won't do that again. Frighten me. Until we change from a kind of culture of the West saving developing countries through development policies and feeling good about it, and then undermining them on trade policies through subsidies and other means, and most of all, not really understanding the need to empower the poor, and that they are trapped in informality that makes it very difficult to access opportunities to better themselves. So it's a very good question, and I can only give you the beginnings of my learning of how important it is to try and answer it.
Please.
Hello, my name is Andrew K. Stein, and I co-chair a networking group of social entrepreneurs. My question is, I think you spoke very well about the problem and its various causes. what are the quick wins, so to speak? What are the regions in the world or the areas of employment or the types of organizing that if you had a large NGO that you could create out of nowhere, that you would focus their work on in a certain part of the world or a certain type of action?
You want to try now?
Well, I'm happy to answer. Nobody else is coming. I just want to. First of all, I think increasingly we're recognizing the role of social entrepreneurs, and they're very, they're very lateral thinkers. And I'm fortunate that I'm able to mix a lot with bringing together social entrepreneurs, whether it's in Davos, the World Economic Forum, or the Clinton Global Initiative, or these various places where they come together. But I also meet them in poor countries that I'm visiting. So for a start, and it's part of the same answer, empower poor people. They're very entrepreneurial. Admire and respect and listen to what they're already doing and help to support that. So I'm not sure exactly what you wanted to get out of your question, but we need to recognize that microcredit helps entrepreneurial activity, but it can also trap people in a certain level of that activity. And we need to build in ways of scaling up and ways of really being, of empowering those in the community who can help to be the drivers of change in the community.
We have somebody at that mic, yes.
Hi, my name is Sheila Lawani. I'm a first-year student here. I really enjoyed what all four of you have had to say about the informal economy, human rights. My question actually is of a more controversial note. Child labor, as the four of you know, and everyone here knows, has been a persistent problem. And there have been laws enacted to eliminate child labor, but it seems that this is still a problem that's persisting. There are some people who believe that child labor will go away slowly, and what we need to do is organize, unionize children and to help them speak up for their rights. The organization I'm considering is the Concern for Working Children in Bangalore, India. And then there are other groups who say that we need to keep working hard to completely eliminate child labor. So what I'm curious to know is, and this is open to all four, what are your thoughts about this? Is it a good idea to unionize workers and child workers and have some sort of representation? Or do you think we should continue working towards elimination? Thank you.
We're not going to eliminate child labor in any near-term future. It's just too big in too many places. And once you have an informal sector, you have too many areas in which the children can work. Most of the groups that I know who work on this would focus on getting their wages up and getting better opportunities for them so they and their family decide to go to school. That may mean replenishing the income that they're going to be giving up by leaving a job. But I don't see the child labor, it's not something that's you can just say, well, we're going to eliminate it. I think even the ILO sort of they want to eliminate the worst forms of child labor. The recognition being that in really poor areas, until we build better opportunities and some money to the families of the children, it's just not going to be a winning ticket. Unions in most of these countries, developing countries, are pretty weak, and they have enough troubles to expect them to go off and organize children seems to me is asking an awful lot.
Anyone else want to comment?
No, I would just share that sentiment. I mean, the ILO has struggled with this problem for a long time and decided to put its emphasis on the worst forms of child labor because that was more doable. You're able to bring governments along, and therefore you're more likely to bring the possibility of enforcement along. But the other side of it is the creation of opportunities, educational opportunities, and economic opportunities. And I'd like to sort of cycle back to the last question, where I agreed with Mary about empowering the poor. There too, there's bridge building to be done. Major multinationals operating in a variety of developing countries don't often think about how it is they could link up local producers with their own procurement. How to encourage entrepreneurship at the local level by creating opportunities. We have our corporate social responsibility initiative. Jane Nelson, and the director of it is here, has a specific focus on the creation of economic opportunities in poor countries for local entrepreneurs and for local suppliers that aren't yet connected to global supply chains, but could be to mutual benefit.
Just very briefly, because I don't want to imply that I have an answer to every question. It's not, but interestingly, yesterday we had the meeting, sorry, not yesterday, this morning. I'm sorry, it seemed like yesterday. We had a meeting of the UN Global Compact Working Group on Human Rights. And this issue of child labor came up. And I heard some interesting company examples of how they're seeking to address it. And I think it's just worth pointing to them. First of all, the International Cocoa Initiative is seeking to develop a multi-stakeholder approach. Ghana was an example where UNDP on the development side, companies like Cadbury's, other stakeholders, local care, BSO, etc., are working, and the start of it is actually to speak to small village communities and get them organized around the child labor issue so that they get mobilized into addressing the conditions where you're going to have less of the child labor, especially the exploitative conditions of child labor. And it was kind of in a spectrum of moving forward. And then the conversation turned to, well, how do we link good practices, if they are good practices, in the cocoa industry with what's happening in the carpet industry, what's happening in sugar? And I think we have an opportunity through the Global Compact networking in a way to begin to see what is the private sector piece of trying to address this, because it's only a piece, and it has to be holistic. We would not have exploitative child labor or child labor that was not acceptable if we had decent work. So it's the other side. So part of addressing it is to begin the process of saying, in this community, how do we work towards conditions of promoting decent work opportunities?
Richard Locke, MIT. First of all, I want to thank all of you for the wonderful presentation. They were really great. My question is for Professor Freeman. I think it's actually incredibly encouraging, the evidence that Michael Hiscox and his excellent work, and also the work that you've done with Kim Elliott, showing that consumers seem to, at least some consumers, some segments of consumers, seem to be willing to vote with their wallets in terms of more ethical consumption. But my concern is always, how do we translate that ethical consumption movement into the kind of power and organization that was mentioned by the other panelists? My fear sometimes is that individual consumers will go buy their fair trade, organically grown, shaded latte at Starbucks, and then sort of check off the box. I've done, I gave it the store, I don't have to do anything more, and I don't have to sort of translate this into the kind of movement that you all were talking about. So how do we actually make that link?
That's a tough question. We're happy when they buy the better made coffee as step one. See, my guess is, it came up a little bit, Mary said it earlier, the internet can be very important in this, because you don't need that many, let's say, activists doing something. And if you reach out to the whole world, all we need is maybe 1 out of 10,000 Starbucks coffee people who said, I want to do a little bit more than this. And you can build on that. Now, the internet doesn't reach that well into some parts of the world. China now has more people on the internet than the US, but of course, they do not allow certain information to go on through there. But as it's going to grow, I think we'll be able to tap more and more people. And the idea is if there's only one person in this city and one person in this village and one person here, we can suddenly create a group of 10,000, 100,000 people. And I don't think it needs more than that to press. So it would be nice maybe if everybody who buys that coffee in the fair trade coffee, if somehow we could get their name and send them a little thing, and they could reject it, but all you need is a small number of people to I think, create the kind of pressures around the world, the activism that you want to see.
Please.
To that, I of course share Richard's sentiment, but I think, Rick, at the end of the day, there isn't any substitute for politics. We've just had a debate in the U.S. Congress on the Colombian Free Trade Agreement, and there was a food fight in the Congress, as you know. One about whether there should be an agreement at all, but the other was that there was a group of Democrats who wanted to mention ILO standards. Unfortunately, the United States doesn't meet all ILO standards, and so that position was not a viable one. That fight has to be fought here at home. If we can't promote ILO standards through a free trade agreement with Colombia, we've got a huge battle right here before we, go out and save the rest of the world, as someone put it before.
Please.
My name's Stephen Donnelly. I'm a student of international development here at the Kennedy School. I'd love to get the panel's opinion on the model of labor immigration as used by Kuwait, where they allow an awful lot of people in, but give them very few rights. The argument is being made in a globalization class I'm doing in the yard that is better than, say, a lot of Western models where we kind of care too much to let many people in. And is there a model to consider or something there for Western countries?
I mean, it's the workers who are temporary workers, which are the Kuwaiti situation, temporary migrants, are unfortunately relatively unprotected in the world. There have been some UN conventions, there were meetings or whatever about what we could do for those kinds of workers. I mean, we're not going to intervene to say the Kuwait has got to let in lots of people and become citizens and so on. That seems to me off the map as long as we have nation states. So I think the way to deal with that is indeed to have some international and strong international rules and regulations that Kuwait and everybody else signs into. And then if they want to have that kind of immigration, we can't stop them. But if we want to have an immigration where ultimately people become citizens, I would bet on us winning out in the end. And eventually they may change their views as they sort of look and say, well, they get workers in, and then the people, they force them out, they leave, whatever it is. But at least we can make some demands that if they're bringing in this short-term migrant labor, that they be protected under certain treaties.
Thank you. Yes.
If I could answer not specifically to Kuwait, but specifically to the United Arab Emirates, because I've been there a number of times to Dubai and Abu Dhabi in recent years, and on International Women's Day this year, the 8th of March, I was invited back to a conference of businesswomen, and I deliberately accepted. And I'd been there before, and I was a friendly face. And I decided to try and use that friendly face to address the issue you talk about, because I find it very uncomfortable going to Dubai or Abu Dhabi, and I haven't recently been to Kuwait, but it's the same issue, that you have this wealth, you have these buildings, you have this financial center now, and yet you have the stark reality of the abuse of migrant workers. You have the abuse of domestic workers. And I wanted to raise this at an award ceremony on the evening, and to do it in a way that would be acceptable, because there's no good in standing up and ranting. You might look good on the newspapers the following morning, but it's not going to achieve anything. And I consulted a friend of mine who lives in Dubai, and I said, I want to raise this. How would you advise? And I also warned the guy who was organizing the conference, I'm going to do it. And he said, go for it. So that was all right. And the advice I got, I took. So what I said was, when I'm here in Dubai, I look around in fascination at these wonderful buildings, and it's incredible what's happening here. But then I have to ask myself, how were these buildings built? Who built them? Under what conditions did they build them? And there was a real silence in the room. And I felt this was the way to kind of begin a process of thinking. Neither Kuwait nor the UAE can continue to be increasingly so-called successful, so-called rich, and actually do it on the backs of workers that they are not treating properly. And that's increasingly just going to be an issue. And I think more and more of us, in a way that's, making, that we're being heard, because we're not doing it in a finger pointing from the outside way. We're doing it as people who've been there and know the situation and saying, I just can't be comfortable with that. And I think we have to say it more.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, hi. My name is Dave Buck. I'm from Cambridge. This is for Professor Freeman and anyone else who wants to join in. It's kind of a general question, but I think it's important, and that is simply, what can countries like the United States do on a macro level to help world wages start moving up? And I realize that, as Professor Freeman said, they are moving up to some extent. However, inequality within countries has also increased. What can we do to stop the race to the bottom on a macro level so that there's more of an incentive, or at least more of a mandate for wages to begin to rise worldwide?
Let me just say goodbye to Mary. She has to catch a plane to New York to say thank you for being with us through the day on this important issue. Yes. Thank you, Mary. Please, Richard.
Yeah. I think what we can best do is, A, be extremely supportive of the workers' movements overseas. We've gone through very mixed things with workers' movements overseas. I mean, when there was the communist unions, in the Cold War, we would support some more friendly to U.S. unions. And now I think our State Department's pretty, that doesn't really care that much, to be a fair statement. So that's one. Two, we have at various times, and the Clinton administration was reasonably good at this, I would say, gave a lot of money to the ILO for supporting the child labor initiatives, which also will help in these things. I mean, it's obviously the faster these countries grow, and if they spread the wealth to the working people, their wages will go up, and it ultimately benefits all of us. I suppose we can have some influence on our corporations, but generally speaking, the big American multinationals operating overseas tend to be the better employers. We pay higher wages, we have better conditions, and whether they could be convinced to try to push more with their other businesses in those areas would be another, interesting possibility. I don't know that they would respond to that.
John?
No.
Okay, I think we'll take two more and then close the discussion, please.
Good evening. My name is Derry Johnson. I'm a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, and I'm one of the fellows here in the National Security Program. And it's sort of a follow-up question to the gentleman's comments earlier regarding Kuwait. Specifically, though, what I want to discuss is the contractual and subcontractual employment of third country foreign nationals, particularly during military contingency operations such as in Iraq. And my concern is, and this is sort of following Professor Freeman's comment talking about these external capital pressures and market-driven corrective measures. The problem that we have if it's the United States is setting out these contracts that are going to Saudi, Kuwaiti, and other nations that are going out and finding third country nationals from all across the globe to drive into Iraq and other areas within the region, who ultimately is really responsible for enforcing oversight of labor rights for those particular workers?
Well, we're going to give the same answer. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
You go ahead.
No, you.
No, I just thought we'll give this.
Yeah.
We'll give the same answer. Well, I think ultimately, if the U.S. is paying for this, it's U.S. Congression, our taxpayers' money, we are responsible. I think that's been one of the key things we've put onto companies, that if they subcontract out, they cannot, that doesn't wash their hands. So they treat their workers well, and they subcontract out to some guy who beats his workers up every night, and they say, oh, I didn't do that. So I'd say the same thing is true here, is the Americans who should be responsible for this. Now, if it is to, I don't know, a Saudi Arabian or Kuwaiti or some other company, they probably have signed in for all these, because most of these countries, as was said, have reasonable labor standards in their laws. And then the trick is we can pressure them, it's their laws. Therefore, they should be, following them. And we've tried to put different provisions in our trade treaties, which just say, just please, you follow your laws, and then that's a reasonable labor standard. For most countries, that is. So it is an issue of pushing the enforcement. But if we're paying the bill, we should be able to pressure them.
Well, it even goes beyond paying the bill, obviously, in the case of Iraq, right? We can't, technically, the host government is responsible for enforcing labor laws. The Iraqi government, as we know, has had trouble getting up and functioning adequately, and we are, after all, the leader of the coalition that invaded Iraq, and we're still there trying to sustain the government. In that kind of a circumstance, I would argue on moral grounds, if not legal grounds, that the home government, especially if it's also paying the bill, has a greater responsibility than would otherwise be the case. And we just, not only with regard to labor conditions, but also with regard to private military contractors, for example, we haven't stepped up.
Mm-hmm. One quick follow-up question. Oh, no, I think we need to close, so let me have the other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted that you've given me an opportunity to speak with you this evening. My name is Myra Frazier, and I am an attorney. I'm from Washington, D.C., formerly with EPA, and a prospective student, and that brought me to campus today. This is an issue that's very near and dear to my heart. I've worked in Africa extensively, and I'm currently advising on a project at Tufts University, my alma mater, dealing with the issue of the mining sector and these very issues of corporate social responsibility. And our work in Ghana, our project is entitled Ghana Gold. We've been looking at the issue of corporate social responsibility in the mining sector in Ghana. And one of the issues, troubling issues that we've stumbled upon is that the Mining Policy Act of 2006 in Ghana splits the ownership rights of land in Ghana, that the surface estate and the subsurface estate ownership interests are split. So owners of the land can enjoy what is above the land, but the mining rights are owned by the government. And what we found most troubling in this is contrary to common law.
We need to get to the question.
Sorry, so the bottom line is, is that the bottom line is how do you deal with legal traditions, whether they be common law or otherwise, that clearly undermine the rights of those individuals who own the land, and how do you deal with that? Because this clearly puts local owners at a disadvantage.
That's a really tough question. I'm not quite sure what exactly you mean. How do we deal with it? Ghana, for better or for worse, adopted a set of regulations, right? With regard to land ownership. Ghana is a sovereign state. It's a well-functioning state by certainly by African standards, if not by wider standards. There isn't, unless it violates some international international standards of human rights or property rights or whatever, there really isn't any appeal beyond what a sovereign state decides to do in its best interest. We can cajole, and if things don't work out, they'll have problems that they need to cope with, and we can advise them, and et cetera, et cetera. But there's no Supreme Court that you can go to now and say what Ghana did was sort of violates the constitution of the world, as it were. There's no place higher to go. That's not a great answer given the substance of it, but that is sort of the fact.
I mean, the problem is mining, the workers are being mistreated. I mean, mining has been traditionally one of the great unionized sectors in the world for exactly the reason that people's lives are at stake and they are easily badly treated. So there you would sort of sit and say, well, okay, how come there isn't a strong union in these mines? And, well, our government certainly can't be involved. Other groups could indeed be saying, okay, how can we strengthen the trade union movement in Ghana in this sector? There's a very strong mining union, of course, in South Africa. I could see some money going to them from some outside groups if they could go and establish training or whatever it would be to help the Ghanaian mine workers. And that would fit with, the mine workers also have a lot of solidarity around the world. So that would kind of fit with them, and maybe they need some push or some outside funds from some organization. Not sure who.
We need to draw this to a conclusion. I want to thank the speakers and, of course, Mary in absentia. And just to say that I think we have had a set of remarks and answers to very important questions that make the issue of government, business, and civil society actually even more complex, because we have home governments and governments where corporations are acting. We have civil society being trade unions, consumer movements, other kinds of associations, and the private sector. We have those willing to join the Global Compact and those not willing. But I think we realize that there are some very good initiatives out there that we all need to learn more about, that we need to link up. But we also have gotten a very clear sense that the pressures are also very much in the other direction of continuing to undermine. So let's go forward and help, as John said, the organize, organize, organize might be the closing mantra. Thank you very much.